So welcome everybody. Some of you are definitely new faces. Some of you are regulars, so it's good to see everyone coming in. Um, so I'm sure you're all probably quite used to doing Zoom meetings now, but they can be quite weird. They can feel a bit stilted. So we'll try to do our best to sort of make it a bit more informal. But just a couple of little rules about how we're going to run today. So Mark and James, who I'll introduce in a moment, will talk for about 20 minutes or half an hour or thereabouts. And then we'll open up the floor, as it were, to questions. What I would like to ask you to do is to send a chat message to me, Richard Paval, who's also shows as the host, and just text me put your message in the chat, and then I'll be able to sort of manage that and send it over to Mark, who will be moderating and will basically call on you when there's a question. So that's how that's going to work. And before I introduce the session, I would just like to say a very quick word about a new project that we've launched this very morning. So we have launched a project called High Water, which is essentially all about celebrating the high tide, the spring tide that happens at the end of March, which is the highest tide of the year. Just have a look. It's very easy to find. It's just high-water.org. So go and have a look. I'll put that in the chat as well. And I would like to, sorry, I'm doing about 3 things at the same time here. I'd like to introduce Mark Leahy, who's going to moderate the session today, kind of chair the session today. And Mark will, in a moment, introduce James, but James and I were just trying to remember the last time we met, and it's quite a long time ago, probably about 2013 or thereabouts. So it's great to have James with us today. Mark, I've also worked with for what seems like quite a lot of years now. It's really nice to have you come forward and do this, Mark. It's really great. Mark is a director of art.earth, one of the directors, a man who is not only an artist but an educator, but incredibly generous with his time as well. So Mark's been on the board, I think, right from the beginning of art.earth pretty much. So I'm going to hand you over to Mark.
Okay, we're doing a relay here, it feels like.
Yes.
Thanks, Richard. Good to see lots of people here. Welcome to the February 21 First Friday from art.earth. And today we've got a presentation, and then we'll open up a conversation with artist James Aldridge. James, I'll let James talk about the project, but James is based in Wiltshire, or he'll give more precise geographical location, and he's talking mainly about a current project he's engaged in called Queer River. And I'm looking forward to hearing about it, and then we'll extend that conversation and then open up and kind of see your responses and get conversations via chat, questions via chat, which we can kind of take through in the second half of the today's First Friday. So over to you, James. Thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen, then I'll introduce myself properly. Right. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah, brilliant. Right, hello, well, thanks for having me. It's really good to be here. So Queer River, it's a new research project that I've set up. It's a project which is which I'm looking at lasting for around a year in its current form. And then who knows, it may well extend and evolve on beyond that. But what I wanted to do, first of all, as Mark said, is just to take you through exactly what it is, what it looks like, what I've done so far, and where I'm hoping to go next. It's very much a research project that's led by my own practice as a visual artist who works with people and places. So my practice is all around supporting people, either other people or myself personally, to use artful ways to explore your local environment. And Queer River I probably set up a couple of months ago, maybe a little bit more. It was in 2020. And things haven't quite gone to plan because of lockdown, but I've adjusted and I'm going with the flow, so forgive the pun. So let's have a little look. I've started off with a little quote from a piece that I wrote for the Climate Cultures website recently, which is all about me exploring queer perspectives from a personal point of view and in terms of my practice as well, and thinking out loud really about how does this relate to this time of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss, and what role do people like me coming with that queer perspective have in a time like this. So I'm just going to read out that little piece. So it says, when I was growing up, I experienced my own queerness as not belonging, not being normal. When I came out as a young man, I took the only label I felt was available to me and defined myself as gay, as other. Now at this time, I see my queerness as a gift, an ability to see beyond the boundaries between straight and gay, masculine and feminine, human and nature. So this work for me very much is about saying, okay, what do I bring to my practice? How do I perceive the world? And what about that relates to my identity as a gay man? So what is Queer River? Like I said, I set it up in 2020. It's a research project that's led by my own artful practice. And it's not sort of defined by pursuing or researching one specific thing. It's very much about the intersection of different perspectives on rivers through, if you like, the lens of my practice as an artist. So it's about LGBTQI people's experiences of rivers. It's about queer perspectives on climate justice. And it's about river restoration and rewilding, and about the relationship between rewilding and queering. And it's about essentially engaging with other people, whether they be humans or non-humans, in walks along rivers, and that being an exchange of views, an exchange of experiences and perceptions of the river. And that then is all held within the wider, bigger picture of climate breakdown. So my main focus is on, it started with my river, which basically runs about half a mile from where I live in the Pewsey Vale in Wiltshire. And it's the Hampshire Avon, or the Salisbury Avon. So it runs from here down through Wiltshire, through Salisbury and down to the sea at Christchurch in Dorset. And as I started to develop or to be in contact with different people who were interested in my work and I was interested in theirs, and we wanted to walk together along this river, also people started popping up along the Bristol Avon. And because I've got a personal relationship, because I grew up part of my life near Bristol, and my dad lived in Bristol for a long time and I was born in Bristol, it just seemed to make sense to actually tag on that Avon as well. So I've expanded it, and some of the walks are taking place along my Avon, if you like, and some along the Bristol Avon. So what I'm doing, and what I'm planning on doing, is to walk along these rivers with ecologists, artists, people that have different relationships with the rivers, that work with the rivers or live alongside the rivers. And we walk and we talk and we make and we exchange perspectives, and I see where that takes me. So just to give you a bit of an example of what that has looked like so far. So the very first walk I went on was with a geoarchaeologist as part of another project. So I still include it in Queer River, even though it was set up by Wessex Archaeology as part of their Ebb and Flow project. And what that project looked like was me and Claire, who was a geoarchaeologist, and there was meant to be a big group of people, but because of COVID, it ended up being me and Claire filmed, and then the film shared with a wider audience. And we walked along the river into Salisbury, and we explored the relationship between the past of the river through its archaeology and the river now and in the future. So as we walked into Salisbury, for instance, we were looking at how urban development has squashed the river and left it with very little room to flood and to change and to evolve over time. Also, I went for a walk with a project manager from the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust water team. And with him, I was looking at how they were restoring rivers, how they were putting the curves and the meanders back into rivers, how they were felling trees into rivers to provide sort of semi-permeable barriers to, again, to create more movement within the water, essentially. I walked with Jonathan Mansfield, who's an artist who is a painter primarily, and I asked him to take me through his process. So he took me on a walk and talked me through his way of relating to the land, which is very much about its history and about, if you like, the spirit of place. And then the last couple, Catherine Lamont Robinson, who is an artist and researcher who's linked with Bristol University. And we were exploring such things as blue health, which is research into the impact on health and well-being that being in or alongside water has. So they're all coming from quite different perspectives, and that's what I'm excited about, really. I get to walk with them and talk with them and learn from them. And then as each walk comes along, connections are made between them. The last one there was Peter Reason, who was a couple of weeks ago. So we went on a socially distanced walk from Pewsey out along the River Avon there. And Peter is doing some work with Schumacher College around panpsychism and rivers. So looking at the sentience of rivers, for instance. So that's what's happened so far. Primarily, there've been people that I know quite well already. There's other people that have kindly offered to come along and have walks, but that's a little bit on hold at the moment. And there's other people that I'm seeking funding so I can also look to employ people to come and walk with me in the future. So that's, if you like, the structure to the research, because although it's quite open and although I want to be responsive and I want the focus to emerge, I also need the balance between that and some sort of structure as well. So if you like, the rivers provide the structure, the walking and the talking and the exchange with other people provides the structure. And there's a website where I write blog posts on each walk as well. And then lockdown came along, and I wasn't able to get out to my studio much. I wasn't able to meet people that much. So I started to use drawing as a way of exploring some of the connections that I was finding across these walks. And a lot of my work is about the embodied experience of place. So how perhaps you can move on from a fixed idea of who you are and what a place is or what a river is, and move towards a more sort of relational way of knowing, a way of knowing through your senses and your emotions and your imagination. So these are examples of drawings that I've been doing at breakfast time, for instance, before homeschooling starts, you know, how to weave this work into the day-to-day of lockdown. And then there's an example of sort of, if you like, accidental or synchronous happenings that are causing my work to slightly go off on a tangent and then be woven back in to the river again. A few weeks ago, I ended up in hospital in a lot of pain, and it turned out to be kidney stones. And some of my conversations with Catherine, who works in, she works quite a lot with medical students and doctors around the role of art in knowing the body and in knowing the whole self. I started to look at the flow of liquid and the flow of fluids through the body and started to look at anatomy and the relationship between the inside and the outside of the body. And I ended up sitting in the urology department in the hospital. And the hospital was understandably hectic because we're in a pandemic. So I had quite a long time to wait. And while I was waiting, a friend texted me. And she said, "Did you know that today is the saint's day of the patron saint of kidney stones?" Which all seemed very synchronous. So I looked him up, did a little bit of research while I was sitting there in the waiting room. And it turned out the patron saint was called Saint Aelred of Rievaulx. And just to summarize that briefly, so Rievaulx Abbey, he was the abbot of Rievaulx Abbey, which is in Yorkshire. And Rievaulx means something like river valley. and some people have adopted him as a kind of a queer patron saint, because there's some discussion about whether his writing relates to homosexuality or relates to what some other researchers call a kind of brotherly or Christian love. So it just seemed very exciting to me that I could sit in a hospital waiting room, that I could develop a new strand to my work that was about the water flowing within the body as well as the water flowing outside of the body, that related to rivers, that related to queerness as well. So within each walk, within each conversation, there's this opportunity to spark an interaction between my ideas and the thoughts of someone else. And all the way through, I'm considering the barriers and the binaries that I come up against in terms of whether it's inside and outside of the body, whether it's above and below the surface, whether it's what is a river itself, where does the water end and the land begin? Because obviously with all of these things, there isn't a definite line. On a map, a river will be represented as a blue line that stops in a certain place. That, for instance, I've been on a walk to find the source of my river, and at the point at which that blue line stopped, obviously the river didn't stop. The water came down from the sky and flowed through the chalk downland and through the plants and into the butterflies that were feeding from nectar on the plants. And so, like I said, my work is about relationship. This project in particular is about, if you like, how queerness can span boundaries or sit in between boundaries, how, as well as being excluded, it gives you kind of a perspective where you can look back and see things in a different perspective, almost like an aerial view, if you like, of flying over the top of these existing or inherited boundaries between things. And so I've started to explore some of those in quite a light touch, playful way. I've just included a tiny little clip, if we can get this video to play. I'm going to play a little bit because I know I'll go over otherwise. So this is, in a very simple way, essentially I bought a waterproof case for my phone and I've been dangling it off of bridges. A lot of the time, access to the river is very limited. To walk along the river is very difficult because it's owned by landowners and controlled perhaps by fishing clubs and so on. So quite often it's the crossing points that are the only available point. And so I started to explore how I could film below the surface and at the surface and start to explore that if you like, membrane, that division between the two. And very briefly, because there are a lot of elements, and I know we haven't got an enormous amount of time, other things like what's the difference between my perception of a river and other animals' perception of rivers. So this puppy on the left is mine, and she's called River, which probably shows that I'm a bit obsessed about rivers. And one thing I've done is to buy a small camera which I can attach onto her and start to explore, if you like, more her viewpoint of rivers as she plays in them, walks in them, swims in them. And the image on the right is from a previous project, which was all about ash trees and the impact of ash dieback disease. And what I did there was to put camera traps on ash trees and allowed the animals that lived in the habitats that these trees provided to record themselves by walking through. And so you can see one is a fox and the other one is my son, who was experimenting with it. So I've joined those together to start to explore the kind of communities that ash trees support and what happens to those animal communities when they die. So that's another way that I'm looking to record and respond to the different beings that live along and in rivers, is potentially to use camera traps and other forms of cameras in and alongside the river. And similarly, before I finish off, I've done a lot of work exploring the relationship between urban and rural place-based arts practice. I had a bursary from AN a couple of years ago, and I worked in a collaboration with an artist called Karen Wood in London, and she'd come and walk with me in Wiltshire. I'd go and walk with her in London, and together we'd explore the interrelationship and the differences and the similarities between urban and rural sort of walking-based arts practices. And that's something I'm doing with the rivers. So in this photo, for instance, I've taken some of the photographs from in the city in Salisbury, and I've returned those to the same river, but further upstream in a more rural area, and started to explore the differences and the similarities between the structures, between the, if you like, the straight-edged, canalized river in the city and the more meandering, softer-edged river near my home. So that's kind of a little summary of my work. I've included another piece of that article here, the same article that I quoted from at the beginning. A little bit about what am I gaining from this, or why am I doing this? So I talked about what it is, but why am I doing this? What do I hope to achieve, I guess? And for me, it's all about walking with and becoming with. It's less about, if you like, inheriting a sense of who you are from what society expects of you, and more developing a sense of identity through relationship with what, you know, the world that you're part of. So I'll just read a little bit of that. And that says, what I've come to realize is that being queer is not about being defined by others as other, but refusing to be colonized or domesticated. It's about being yourself in spite of the restrictions you may face, a self that you discover through relationship with human and non-human others. In this way, I see it as closely related to rewilding, whereby if the right conditions are put in place, the land begins to heal itself, bringing health to it and us. So there's a lot of focus on rewilding at the moment, and restoration and so on. And I kind of see my practice as in a sense, kind of rewilding myself, if you like. It's an opportunity for me to explore who I am through relationship with the more than human world, of which, you know, we are all interconnected parts, rather than viewing the world from this inherited sense of who I am or am not by how I said at the beginning, I felt I had to define myself, if that makes sense. So it's all about exploring relationships between rivers and people, and how each can inform an understanding of the other. And I've just popped that there so people can have a little look and read up on some of the blog posts and find out in a bit more depth what that actually looks like in practice. Thank you, Mark. So I stop sharing.
I realised I was on mute. Thank you, James.
Okay.
Thank you for that. And lots of sort of things sparking off in my mind from that. So there's a couple of things kind of maybe theoretically I was going to kind of just touch on first. And I was thinking of the work of Sarah Ahmed in her book Queer Phenomenology, which I don't know if you've read it or seen it, but she uses, one of the things she works with is this idea of orientation, and she takes orientation and uses that, borrows it, if you like, from kind of sexual orientation, and then puts it into relationships and puts it into spatial and phenomenological relationships. And when you were talking about that, those senses of above and below, and kind of situating yourself in relation to the river and in relation to the other elements of the community, it kind of brought that to mind. And I don't know if you want to say something more about those kind of spatial and phenomenal relationships.
Oh, I don't know what to say about that at the moment, to be honest. I mean, just so people know, Mark and I had a little conversation yesterday about some of this work, and what I said was that very much this isn't at the end of the research, so it's not necessarily at a point at which I feel like I can articulate all of it verbally or through words. It's very much in a playful, process-based place. And what I'm doing feels very much of the same kind of you know, terminology and practices that you're describing. And if I sat down to write about it, I could probably put it into those words. But at the moment, that's not what's ready to come out, if you know what I mean.
if I take you, so one of the blogs where you talk about like looking for this notion of looking for the origin of the river and the kind of source, and there's that sense that mapping, which is kind of runs through this project and some of your other work, and there's a sense that what would it mean to find the source of the river, and what kind of thinking and sort of relationships involve kind of naming that and nailing that down. And when you go to find it, you describe a very different experience in the blog.
And it's almost difficult to go back to being in the place of before I got to the point at which I couldn't find the source, and then my thinking changed. It's almost hard to go back to being that person, if you like. But yes, I was going on a walk along the river because it was prior to Queer River, and I was doing some work with an artist called Kathy Skerritt, who's based in the States. And originally I was going to fly over and do some work with her, and then I decided to stop flying, and so we started to look at different ways of doing that. And so she'd walk along her river, I'd walk along mine, and then we'd exchange through Skype conversations. And I think I wanted to get a better sense of the shape of the river, how it related sort of geographically or spatially to the landscape in which I'm in, and to maps, because like you say, I'm very interested in maps and mapping, but I'm more interested in maps and mapping in terms of how maps can document individual experiences rather than provide like a sort of objective truth, if you like. And I think you can look at a map and you can, almost what you expect from maps, like an audience survey map, is very different to me to that lived embodied experience of a place. So I was walking along the river expecting to get to a place where maybe there was a spring and water bubbled up through the ground, but it wasn't. There was a kind of slightly darkened channel across a field where you can see there was more water that normally ran there in terms of the undergrowth that was growing there. But when I got to the point on the map at which, this blue line began, it was basically a concrete farm track. And so I kept on walking, and as I walked up the hill, there was really rich, it was in the summer, so really rich sort of plant life. It's chalk downland, so there was a lot of sort of scabious and different wildflowers there. So I went sort of from disappointment of not being able to find it to a kind of realization of, well, there isn't one, that's why, because there isn't a point at which the river begins. And as I walked up onto the hill, there was an old water tower, which obviously people used to collect or hold water in before. And there was a ladder up to the water tower, and I took a photo of looking up this ladder going up almost into the sky, and that almost led me to this realization that the river continues up on into the sky and around in a cycle. And I know we were talking a little bit yesterday about that kind of cycle that you see in children's sort of geography textbooks in terms of the water cycle. And at that point you think, well, of course it's obvious there isn't a specific source. But the realization of that isn't such a sort of cerebral conscious thing. It's more of it's quite hard to describe, but yeah. I don't know if that kind of answers what you were asking.
And I think it goes with those other kind of curious thing in, say, school geography books where we see the longest rivers and we see these kinds of measurements of rivers, and they're laid out. There's that diagram, I remember a kind of illustration where all the world's kind of great rivers were done on a kind of linearly represented alongside each other on a graded scale, where the kind of biggest and longest, and when you, as you describe that, you then get to a point where you're thinking, but how could you measure the Mississippi or the Amazon or the Thames or the Avon? Because where would you stop your pedometer or your piece of string or whatever it is you were using to
Absolutely. And then the same in terms of the width. You might be able to just about see where the more visible water edges come, but is that where a river stops? I was talking to someone at the Beaver Trust this week about doing some work with them in relationship to Queer River, and they were talking about a campaign that they've got coming up to establish buffer zones alongside rivers, so whether they're 5 meters or 10 meters either side. And suddenly that got me thinking about how whether if that did come into law and that did become the normal practice, would people's thought about what a river is suddenly extend by 5 meters or 10 meters? You know, we tend to talk about river corridors, so it tends to be that very, like you said, linear version. But yes, as well as where it starts or stops, what about, you know, where the water feeds into the ground? When I went for a walk with Peter Reason a couple of weeks ago, we went to a nature reserve where is very peaty and boggy, and where there's lots of little rivulets, I don't know if that's the right word, little tiny streams that are wiggling throughout. And so if you like, the river isn't in one place, the river is dispersed throughout the land, and the land and the water are indivisible. And I think that's similar to what beavers end up doing to an environment as well, in terms of interrupting the flow. And again, what the Wildlife Trust were looking to do in terms of interrupting the flow. So, yeah.
It, in the chat, Richard Pavaz just mentioned kind of a parallel experience where he went looking for another Avon, which we have here in Devon, which is the one which goes up to Owen Head, and you arrive at a mere or a marsh kind of at the top where it does flow out of that, but there isn't a neat point that you can kind of measure to. One of the questions which kind of when you were speaking again that came up, and this has also kind of come in from Sage Bryce, is a question around where you were talking about access points and crossing points and relationships of ownership of the river, and kind of how that might, in a sense, how some of the project might attempt to queer some of those ownership or control relationships.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I was in bed last night reading just before I went to sleep, and I got to what I think is the last, I'm looking across there because I'm trying to see what the title of the book is. What the last chapter of is the Nick Hayes book, The Book of Trespass. And then I think it's the last chapter, it might be the last, second to last or something. He starts to explore trespass and rivers and the ownership of rivers, and how quite often if you're canoeing down a river, you are trespassing because the landowner on one side basically owns up to the center of the river, and the landowner on the other side basically owns up to the center of the river. And then quite often angling clubs or whoever kind of, this might not be the right terminology, but kind of own the watery bit, if you like. So yeah, I found it really frustrating in terms of not being able to be alongside what I call my river. You know, I can access it at certain specific points. And when I went for the walk with Neil from the water team, I was able to see a lot more because they work in partnership with landowners. So he was able to take me along some sort of private stretches of the river, which was lovely. But it does make you realize what a tiny percentage of our rivers are accessible.
Yeah. Did I was just whether Sage, you wanted to kind of add to that question, or if you wanted to come in on that.
Oh, you did a lovely job of summing it up for me. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I was curious about how I was really intrigued by that thing of the only access points being these crossing, and how that ties in as well to stuff you were saying about thresholds and surfaces and binaries and so on. And then and whether you'd been exploring how that related to the whole thing of control of and ownership of the river, and like whether you had thoughts on that theme.
I think, thank you for that. I think at this moment I've sort of noticed it, if you like, so it's kind of logged, but I haven't got much further in terms of exploring it. Apart from, for instance, so reading that book connects with that for me. So I'm starting to reach out for other ways of looking at it and reading about it and understanding it, but I haven't got much further than that yet. So it very much feels like it's a, if you like, a point in the research whereby lots of things are bubbling up and I'm excited by them. And so I'm having to sort of identify ones that I'll follow up first and then maybe park some others for a little bit later. But yeah, absolutely, that is a key part because, and that's another thing that I'm really enjoying is that, you know, I started out with this idea that I'm going to walk along my river and then I can't walk along my river. But the fact that I can't then gives me another thing to research. So that's what I'm excited by, that because I've set this up for myself, and because I'm not necessarily being given an agenda by anyone else, I can sort of pause and decide, do I want to go that way or that way? And so when these things pop up, I can choose to follow them up, which is lovely.
It's
That
really
doesn't necessarily answer your question.
It's really beautiful how it weaves together so many related threads. It's, yeah, really love it.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sage. We had another comment or question, or Liz McGowan was kind of would like to kind of join the conversation. Do you want to come in on that, Liz?
Yes, hi.
Hiya.
I just found myself nodding all the way through your talk, James, because I've been involved in a really similar process over the last 6 months, and it came out of for me it came out of a practice where I've been making a series of cloaks. Each one is about a different habitat, and the question of them really is about what would it be like to wear that landscape like a skin.
Mm.
So in a sense, the cloak is not about protecting you from a place, but it's about putting you in a kind of skin to skin contact with it, if you like. And for a while it's just been a kind of a background process about wanting to make one for the river around here, and then it kind of linked into I live not far from Norwich, and there's a big road going across the Wensum, and these are all chalk streams, I have to say, and I think yours is a chalk stream too.
Yes, so. It is, yeah.
And it's kind of a ridiculous scenario, and yet it's sort of being pushed ahead, this big river which is going across, you know, triple SI, chalk stream, endangered chalk stream, whatever. So there was that, and then it was just like various things fed in, and I've also been walking and having conversations with, you know, with river restorationists and other artists. And then lockdown happened, and I had to kind of, you know, home in onto my river and have conversations with people when they've been walking out on their rivers. So that's been happening. But one of the things about being here I've noticed is that, I just wondered if you'd had the same thing, which is about how there's almost a different kind of map that the river has to the human map is very different from the river map. So one of the things that I've become very aware of through researching and walking down to my local rivers, and there's a small river called the Mermaid that comes into a bigger river called the Bure, about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away from where I live. So they're both kind of quite. But I've just noticed that I've begun to think about watersheds. And about where I live in relation to that. And then I suddenly thought, oh my God, I live halfway between, I live on the high bit between these two river valleys, if you like. And also that thing about the kind of crossings. It's like, there's another map that we can't follow.
Yes, yeah.
Kind of cross it here and dip in here and dip in there. You know, it's not like a road we can follow. It's not like a coastline we can walk along or whatever. It's quite kind of it's obscured. And likewise the sources. You know, I've also had that experience of the sources, and I think it's because the water comes down through the chalk, doesn't it? And it's the chalk that filters it and makes it so beautiful and pure. And then it sort of comes out in much more subtle ways near the bottom of the chalk hills. And so there isn't a kind of clear, it's not like a spring coming out of the ground, is it? It's more sort of coming out of the hills, but coming through them, permeating through them in this extraordinary way. So
yeah,
anyway.
absolutely.
so much. It'd be really nice to carry on talking about this.
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks,
we'll have to get in
Liz.
touch and share, compare notes.
Yeah.
One of the things you were saying there, Liz, picks up as a comment and not a question, which came in about borders and about lines and how rivers sometimes work as those kind of lines and borders, and we kind of take them for granted. And I grew up on a county boundary that was a river border, and on one level we kind of took it for granted. It was like, oh yes, the people over there are from Kerry. But on another level, it was this kind of continuous, it was a single space rather than which had the river running through it, rather than these two things which met. And again, it's that question of orientation and perspective and kind of looking at relationship around those kind of boundary lines. I don't know if that's kind of come up within the Avon, James, where it kind of divides or joins.
Less, to be honest. I mean, it may well do further south. I mean, my plans to, if you like, walk the length and interact with people along the length haven't come to fruition yet because of lockdown, basically. So I spent a lot more time focused on my own local stretch and down as far as Salisbury, and not a huge amount further this time. So that is to come, and that may be the case further down, but not where I am, essentially. I think because where I am, it's perhaps so little that it's not seen as such a clear, strong boundary, maybe.
Yeah, it's like the Severn or the Wye or those rivers kind of being kind of major boundaries, I guess, and kind of hard to cross.
Yes, yeah.
There was another question which came in. Ellie Lestas was picking up on the comment where you were talking about looking at notions of sentience and the river being part of a kind of larger sentient and having its own sentience. Did you want to ask a question, Ellie, or just hear from James on that? Your microphone's doing something odd. You're not on mute, but we can't hear you. No.
You could put a question in the chat, maybe, and I could.
Yeah, I think Ellie's comment was about sentience. She was really asking if you have any opinion on that, and what that means to you if you talk about sentient rivers.
Yeah, I mean, that really connects with the conversation that I was having with Peter Reason, the other day. And I think I saw on Twitter, I think it was that Peter's, just to give him a little advert, for want of a better word, he's a little publication that's just come out called On Sentience, which includes the sentience of rivers. So you'd probably be interested in that. And similarly, when I was working with Kathy Skerritt in the States, quite often it came down to the point where we were thinking, well, what do we want to do next, or where should we go next, or what should we look at next? And quite often the answer was, well, let's ask the river. So I don't know if that kind of answers what you're saying in a way, is that but then I also come back to, well, what is the river? And when I was talking to Peter, I guess that we were talking about the river as a community of organisms, a community of life forms. And he was sort of saying that if he talks to the river, especially in relationship to panpsychism, quite often now he would expect the river to respond. So if he's bringing an offering perhaps of water that he's collected somewhere else, or if he's coming in with a particular mindset, then he particularly mentioned kingfishers. So if he felt like if he came to the river with a certain sort of mindset or with a certain sort of question, quite often he'd see a kingfisher, and that felt like a very, I'm trying not to use the wrong words for his work, but a sort of conscious response by the river, if you like. And almost the more we believe in the sentience of the river, the more then we can sort of expect something to come back to us. which brought us onto language and what is language. And are we seeing things because we want to see them, or are we seeing them because they are sort of being offered up to us? So we started to talk about the language of place, because he's very much a writer. I'm very much a visual artist, and we were exploring. I'm very interested in how I can document my experiences of a place. So, for instance, walking and making some kind of a bundle from the things that I collect, which Mark, you mentioned, is like a form of mapping in itself. And Peter had asked if he could do one as we walked together. So I was sort of sharing my practice with him. And so we started to talk about the distance between the lived experience and the art or the art object, and whether there's more distance with writing than perhaps there is with making. So that doesn't necessarily, for me, that's all tied up with sentience. Do you know what I mean? Because it is about the language of the river, and by touching the river and collecting and feeling and making, I feel like I am receiving a message almost. I am reaching out and touching, and by touching, I'm being touched in return. It's that kind of thing.
Did you, as a kind of addendum to that, and you may not want to go here because it may not be your term, but the notion of panpsychism, what that means for you or within the project, or does it?
I'm not sure yet, to be
Yeah.
honest. Again, it's something that came out of my conversation with Peter, and something that he's very much exploring, and we're gonna keep in contact. And the next time he came over to my river, next time I'm going over to his, and we're going to continue that conversation. So again, it's something that I've sort of logged to return to, but not something that I feel I have full understanding of yet, or what I think of it fully yet. That's on the list, basically.
Yes. There've been a couple of comments around sentience, and I think you kind of mentioned that notion of where it overlaps with a word like consciousness, and how they kind of, whether they occupy the same territory, if that's the right term. And in the way when you were describing that sense of the kingfisher and the being open to or being receptive to possibility, or being receptive to the moment or the encounter.
Yeah, and I've thought about it quite a lot recently on recent walks during lockdown. Doing homeschooling, and my son's busy downstairs at the moment, but to break it up, we walk down to the river and we see what's happening around the river. You know, and we do talk to the river. We go and say hello to the river, and we look at how it's flooding and those kind of things. And I've started to think about, well, how would a river or the river respond, and what would that look like, and how would I read that, if you like? And I started to think more about dance, I think, and movement and so on. And I was watching a buzzard sort of riding the thermals above the river and looking at the moving plants within the river, and thinking more about, if you like, watching that like you would watch a dance, and how it communicates something to you, but it's not necessarily in the same way as speech, if that makes sense.
And also that kind of connected, because one of the things I was thinking of was when you mentioned River the dog, or the puppy, and you were talking about kind of equipping the dog with camera, but also the dog sensory world will be very different to ours.
Yes.
With a lot more smell sensation going on.
Yeah, and I wrote. Sorry.
Go on.
I was just going to say, I was thinking the same thing, because I'm aware that me putting a camera on a dog doesn't allow me to understand what they're sensing. It's more me changing the viewpoint of my lens, if you like. But I wrote a piece before about my previous dog and the relationship that it has with smell. And that's in one of the Dark Mountain books. I can't remember which one at the moment. But yeah, I'm very interested in that, in terms of the richness, and I quite often have conversations with my son as we go on a walk, and he's saying, why does she keep smelling everything? Why is she smelling that dog's bottom? That's disgusting. And we talk about how what she might know from that, and how we can't fully put ourselves in her position to know what she knows. But just because she doesn't know in our way, it doesn't mean it's any less than or different to or disgusting, if you like. It's about wondering perhaps what she might know and talking about it. And in some ways, I think that's as far as sometimes we can get.
And maybe because you mentioned the buzzard and the kind of sense of how the air temperatures over the river will be different from the fields, and how the birds' experience of those temperatures and air pressures and that kind of kinesthetic sensory experience is completely different from ours.
Yes.
Although you can respond to it in that sense of engaging with it in terms of the movement and that kind of larger dance that you were describing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I'm going to do it is probably the answer. But that I know that I recognize that I don't want my work to all be about people's experiences of rivers. So I wanted to put that in, that is, you know, that is an integral part of the research, that it's not just about the relationship between people, the differences or similarities between people. It's about between people and other animals, and people and other plants. Sorry, people and plants, for instance. So I haven't come up with a, you know, complete plan for that, but that is part of what's going to happen.
Great. I'm just just checking in the chat, and there was a comment about, and maybe this is picking up on the sentience question of whether the river, or can the river, or can we even ask the question of, does the river know what it is, or who it is, or how it is?
Yeah, well, I feel like my son is like a bit of a guru on this at the moment, because he keeps asking me those kind of questions, and then maybe questions that I wouldn't ask myself if he didn't. So he'll say things quite often about the dog because she's more present, but he'll say things like, does she know she's a dog? And I'll say, well, it depends what you mean by a dog. She wouldn't know the word dog, but if through smell she would know what another dog was, but she wouldn't necessarily know it in the same way that we'd know it by using a word. You know, so these conversations, it's like the sort of philosophy for children kind of questioning. It sort of goes round and round in circles, and it gives you a hint or a sense or a shape of something, but without necessarily being able to sort of unpick it in a more conscious or cerebral way, if that makes sense. So, and certainly my conversations with Kathy Skerritt in the States, very much about kind of how will you know unless you fully commit to it. And the same with Peter, really, that if, you know, you can sort of play around with the idea of sentience, but unless you fully commit yourself to believing that something is sentient, then you're not necessarily going to get a response that confirms that. So maybe I'm working myself up to that through experimenting with talking to the river, and through experimenting with what a response might look like.
Thanks. We've had another comment from Helen Otway, and Helen's up more your direction. She's near Frome, talking. And I don't know if you want to come in on this, because you were talking about swimming and being in the river, Helen. You're.
Yes, I think being in the river is very different from being beside the river. From a kind of altitude point of view, but also you get a very different view, and you can go to some of the places that you can't go beside the river if you can swim far enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, my river is a bit too small where I am, so I've got in it in terms of wading around, but I can't necessarily swim in it. So that the plan is certainly further downstream, when I can access those points, is to go with that more. For now, it's been sort of paddling and wading and the dog swimming. Although I have obviously swum in other rivers as part of this specific piece of research or this project, that hasn't happened as yet. One of the reasons that I called our puppy river was that we were down in Devon, and we were spending a lot of time around the Dart. In a little period of time last summer when lockdown opened up and there was the heat wave, and that really sort of opened my eyes, or opened my body to the possibility of knowing rivers in that way, really, by swimming underneath them and just feeling them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I want to do a lot more, but it's not quite happened yet.
Come to the Frome and swim at Farley Hungerford.
That's a good spot, is it?
Yeah, and it's very near Wiltshire. I think it goes into Wiltshire.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Keeping local-ish.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen. One of the things which came up, which Richard was interested to ask earlier, and it's been touched on, but maybe just come back to it, is this question of rewilding and its relationship to queering.
Yeah.
And it made me think again, without bringing too theoretical a kind of angle in it, but the work of somebody like Jack Halberstam, who's written about wildness and queerness and an intersection of them.
Yeah.
And they might be kind of one kind of place where that question might kind of overlap.
Yeah, I've been looking at their work, so I've made a start on that, certainly. And also, there was a particular podcast that I found really useful, that if I could remember, I could put it on the... Is there a way of sending out to people afterwards? Because I think it's really useful. It's helped inform my thinking around it. I think it was from an organisation in the States called Queer Nature, I'm pretty sure. And it was, yeah, it just connects with the kind of things that you're talking about, really. And it's also about the fact that we're living in sort of, they were describing it as kind of liminal times, that we're on the sort of on the edge in terms of sort of collapse and change and so on, and that people that have come, that have experience of liminality in terms of queerness could be good guides because of what they can bring and so on. And it also relates to sort of LGBT experiences of rural places as well, in terms of them being like a place of trauma or danger or so on, and how growing up LGBT, quite a lot of people would have a sort of sense of hypervigilance in terms of being conscious and aware of themselves and their safety, and how that can translate potentially into being sort of hyper aware of kind of what we were talking about before, the signals that you receive from other organisms and so on, so sounds or movements or those kind of things. So it's a more, so it's like wildness in terms of like a rewilding of your senses, I guess, in terms of that, the connection or the interconnection between yourself and the rest.
Yes. On that question of the podcast, I think we can add, because the talk will go on to the art.earth website, and we can add kind of information like that as a note, or we can add a link and include that there. We're kind of coming up to 2 o'clock, so we'll kind of, that's our, it's, the guillotine won't come down, but that's our sort of allotted time. So if that's okay, there aren't any other urgent questions that are in the chat. So I'd just like to thank you, James, for the presentation, for the conversation, and for kind of the sharing that we've had this afternoon. And we'll be able to kind of share this information and put the talk up on the art.earth website.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Richard to say goodbye.
I really just wanted to reiterate as well that to find this on the website, just go to the website, put in First Friday, it'll come up with the page, and it will be on the same page where you found the information for the Zoom. So if there are any extra, the chat window will also be there, and there's quite a lot of good information in the chat.
Yeah, because I'd like to look at that as well, because I haven't had a chance to look at the chat, so
of course not,
to catch up.
And I just wanted to say thank you again to everybody who came along. We had a great crowd, and I hope you enjoyed the session, and we will see you next month. Next month we've got 3 artists, I believe. I'm afraid I don't have the name in front of me, and in April, which happens to coincide with Good Friday, James mentioned Dark Mountain, and we will have Charlotte from Dark Mountain, who will be talking about their next book, which is about to come out, which has a working title of Requiem, although I believe that the title is changing. So come along for that one as well. And thanks again, everybody. And thank you, James. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Richard.
And great. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Bye,
much,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.